Thank you, comrades. I'd like to begin first by saying I think this has been a fantastic school, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak in this session on a subject very close to my heart, the greatest philosopher and revolutionary who ever lived, Karl Marx. Now, the theme of this whole weekend is the pillars of communism. And today, and for more than 100 years, the word communism is synonymous with the name of Karl Marx and with Marxism. But what is Marxism? Is it a political program? Is it an economic theory? It certainly contains these things. But most importantly, it is a philosophy, a method, a way of seeing the world and relating to it. In fact, more than a pillar, it is the base upon which the whole construction of Marxism rests. It is what enabled Marx to develop the theories and make the predictions that he did, that were so powerful and correct, that they tell us more about the world today than anything written in the universities in the last 140 years. Now, I don't have a hope of saying everything there is to say about this wonderful philosophy, but what I hope to do in this introduction is set out Marx's own journey towards the development of his ideas, to explain how the principles of what we call Marxism emerged, so that we can better understand them and apply them in our activity. Now, Marx was born in the city of Trier in Western Germany on the 5th of May, 1818. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of historical context into the world in which Marx was born. Now, Trier had experienced the storm and stress of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It had been occupied by French forces at one point, but then had fallen under the rule of the Kingdom of Prussia after the defeat of Napoleon and the restoration of absolutism in Germany and France. And this meant that Marx was born into a period of political reaction, of repression and censorship. But under the surface of this apparent stability, you start to see the beginnings of capitalist development. Certain economic reforms, like the formation of an all-German customs union to protect the nascent German industry, helped to foster the development of an industrial bourgeoisie proper in Germany, although this was small and scattered across the country. But at the same time, Germany didn't exist in a vacuum. You had the Industrial Revolution taking place in England, and the rise of liberalism in Britain and France, and the French Revolution of 1830, July 1830, which overthrew, once again, the old Bourbon dynasty and replaced it with a new dynasty, more favorable to the bourgeoisie in France. This event was watched with sympathy by a wide layer of German bourgeois and intellectuals, including Marx's own father, Heinrich Marx. Marx's father had had to convert from Judaism to Protestantism in order to maintain his civil rights under the Christian Prussian state. He held to the principles of the Enlightenment, and he actually held a small private celebration for the July Revolution in 1830, but only a private one, because he didn't want to draw too much unwanted attention. And this fact illustrates an important part of the context into which Marx was born. Political activity, more or less of any kind, was absent in Germany at this time. Living under absolutist repression, the bourgeoisie was weak economically, insignificant politically, and so it turned to literary and philosophical activity to express its views. And so the struggles being carried out in practice by the British and French bourgeoisies were translated into German thought as philosophical principles. Political demands were translated into pure moral ideas by German philosophers. Marx and Engels make the interesting point that it was actually Germany's relative backwardness that allowed it to play first fiddle, have the first rank in philosophy at that time. And this was the intellectual environment in which Marx grew up. His father made sure that he was educated in Enlightenment principles of reason and progress, but also important ideas from the romantic, artistic, and philosophical movement at the time, such as freedom and action. He first started going to university in the city of Bonn, which is also where he began his relationship with Jenny von Westphalen, who became Jenny Marx. But it seems like he was enjoying the student life a little bit too much at the start, because he was eventually sent to university in Berlin, which at that time was the university of Hegel and Hegelian philosophy. At this time, the ideas of the great German philosopher Hegel were dominant throughout Prussia. But interestingly, at first, Marx didn't like Hegel. He complained about what he called the rocky melody of his writing. So don't worry, Marx found Hegel as difficult to read as the rest of us. And he resisted Hegel because he felt his ideas didn't elevate freedom and lofty ideals as highly as other philosophers, like Kant and Fichte. And to give you an example of this, I'd actually like to quote a poem that Marx wrote as a teenager, which was intended as a satire on Hegel. Kant and Fichte soar to heaven's blue, seeking for some distant land. I but seek to grasp profound and true, that which in the street, I find. He wasn't very impressed with this idea that you just look in the street for what's profound and true. But this was all about to change. There's a fascinating letter that Marx writes to his father when he's 19 years old in November 1837. And he begins the letter, "There are moments in one's life which are like frontier posts, marking the completion of a period, but at the same time clearly indicating a new direction." And the reason I wanted to quote this remark is because there are several such turning points in Marx's life. You see these important staging posts in his journey, if you like, towards Marxism. And I'll try to draw these out in the course of this introduction. But at this point, Marx talks about how he threw himself into his studies. He was still studying law and jurisprudence, and like a very good student, he tried to compile a complete system of law. I have to admit that when I studied the same subject, I was not taken by the same urge, but I'm glad Marx tried it for me. First, what he did was he wanted to ascertain the essence of law itself. And so from that, he deduced a number of logical categories. And then once he had worked out his system of categories, he thoroughly researched cases, legal history, in order to absorb the subject matter and make it fit, to fill up the system that he's just come up with in pure thought. And this is a method that he said was directly inspired by that of Kant. But he writes to his father saying that he'd written up to 300 pages and realized that, in his own words, everything, well, it's not exactly his own words, he'd realized everything he'd done was rubbish, worthless. You can see the despair and frustration in his writing. He said it was like pouring sand into empty drawers. And a comment he makes, which I think is very profound, is that this was a limitation of idealism. He said, the opposition between what is and what ought to be, which is characteristic of idealism, stood out as a serious defect. He continues, "The mistake lay in my belief that matter and form can and must develop separately from each other." And so having reached this dead end, he reluctantly turned to Hegel. Marx says that during a long period of illness, he read all of Hegel. Maybe that's the best way to read Hegel. And he was completely convinced. And what I find fascinating is that Marx is approaching Hegel from the standpoint of rejecting idealism and seeking truth in reality. There's a famous expression from Hegel, "The truth is concrete." Marx said, "I arrived at the point of seeking the idea in actuality itself, in reality as it presents itself to us." Marx effectively learned to seek what is true and profound in the street, as he said in his poem. And this actually becomes an absolute constant throughout his life. What he had taken from Hegel is the dialectical method itself, which he developed and used throughout his life and works. Now, what does this mean? The term dialectics comes from the ancient Greek word for conversation or dialogue. It often took the form of opposing points of view, contradictory points of view, which in correcting mistakes and stripping away the accidental in what each was saying, arrive at a higher level of understanding. But dialectics doesn't just mean a conversation. And dialectical philosophy actually took this principle of contradiction and negation and placed it in the development of all things, made it the moving and generating principle of all life and development. And Hegel placed this at the center of his logic. But what does this mean? One aspect is that everything, all things, actually contain their opposite and are transformed into their opposite by the necessary course of development. Life contains death and cannot exist without death. East is west, up is down. Day becomes night and vice versa. What this means in practice is the recognition that nothing is pure, fixed, self-contained. All things are interconnected and in a constant process of what Hegel called becoming, of development, of evolution, of coming into being and passing away and being transformed into their opposite. But the transformations that make up existence aren't random or externally imposed. They have their own internal logic, which can only be discovered by immersing oneself in the subject matter, in reality as it presents itself to us, not in abstract principles outside of or above reality, to draw out the laws, the logic contained within. And this approach to philosophy is inherently scientific, if used correctly, but even more important, it's inherently revolutionary. The Russian writer Alexander Herzen described dialectics as the algebra of revolution. Why? Because it teaches us to see the inevitable emergence of the new within the womb of the old. Dialectics boldly announces, in the words of the German poet Goethe, all that exists deserves to perish. It condemns all empires and social orders to eventual oblivion. But the result of that destructive, negative process is not simply the reduction to nothingness, but to new, higher forms, which arise out of the necessary course of development. And so perhaps it's not a coincidence that Marx's conversion to dialectical philosophy coincides with his entry into radical politics. In Berlin, he encountered what he called a doctors' club and what we know of as the young Hegelians or left Hegelians. But what made them left Hegelians is not that they were socialists or communists. It actually reflected a contradiction in Hegel's own philosophy between his dialectical method, which emphasized change, and the conservative conclusions that he put forward in his political philosophy. For instance, he wrote that Protestantism was the highest form of religion, and that religion was essential for what he called absolute knowledge. And this was at a time when Protestantism, I can't even say it, was the state religion of the Kingdom of Prussia. And what was known as the old Hegelians basically used Hegel's philosophy to defend the status quo that existed in Prussia at that time, whereas the young Hegelians were using him to argue for radical reform. I wouldn't describe them as revolutionaries, though. What they wanted to do was take up positions in the state bureaucracy and in the university in order to mold the nation through thought, effectively. And the young Marx writes to his father saying that's the career he'd like to take as well. Unfortunately for him, but perhaps fortunately for us, the Prussian state did not agree with that career path. The Prussian bureaucracy prevented all the young Hegelians from obtaining professor positions, and so Marx decided to take up journalism as a way of spreading his ideas. And it's at this time that he gets involved in the Rheinische Zeitung, the Rhineland Times, and he becomes the editor of this publication at the age of 23 in 1842. So at this time, he's not a communist. You could describe him as a radical liberal. But even in these articles, you can see Marx's sympathy with the poor and oppressed, and his contempt for the landowners who were pushing peasants off the land, robbing them, and then punishing them for stealing wood that had fallen on the lord's estates, which used to be their land. This was a scandal that he wrote about at the time. And once again, the Prussian censor pops up. Even these articles are unacceptable, and they put pressure on the paper. The shareholders start to panic. And Marx actually resigns from the Rheinische Zeitung rather than accept any censorship. In fact, one Prussian official at the time said in a report that Marx would die for his ideas. And so at this point, we start to see some fundamental characteristics of Marx that would lead to his development as a Marxist, I would say. This striving to dive into and grasp reality, this indignation at the suffering of the oppressed, but also this iron determination, which never leaves him. Every time he encounters a block or a limitation, rather than just accepting it or backing down, if anything, he becomes more belligerent, more determined to overcome it. And so faced with this block of the Prussian censor, Marx leaves Germany. He spends a short period of time in Switzerland and then ends up in Paris in October 1843, where he begins editing a new publication called the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuche, the Franco-German Annals. And this transition sees him move beyond Hegel to the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach, but also to communism. Now, I've mentioned the impact of Hegel's dialectics on Marx, but that's not all there is to be said about Hegelian philosophy. Hegel was always an idealist. What this means is not that he had lofty ideals or he was a lover of mankind or something like that. It means he believed that ideas had their own objective, independent existence and that they determine the sensuous, material world that surrounds us. He called his philosophy absolute idealism. Specifically, he asserted that everything begins with the absolute idea. This is supposed to represent the unity of the infinite universe. This idea then negates itself dialectically, turns into its opposite, which is all of the distinct phenomena of the universe, nature, human beings, etc. But this then negates itself again when the absolute idea is realized in the form of human consciousness, through the development of human knowledge, and culminating in Hegel's consciousness in particular. And so the problem with this is, despite his concreteness, Hegel's philosophy still saw all development as fundamentally that of the logical development of ideas. And this actually led to the same dead end that Marx identified in 1837 in that letter I mentioned. Development, progress is all to be found in the mind, and specifically in the various ideas and systems made up by philosophers, which were then imposed on reality, and often with completely sterile results. And Hegel's system is an example of this. As I mentioned earlier, his vision of the highest level of human knowledge was just an idealized picture of what already existed in the world at that time. For that reason, Engels would later describe Hegel's system as a colossal miscarriage. The young Hegelians, like Bruno Bauer, weren't much better, to be honest. They just replaced God, or the absolute idea, with this idea of self-consciousness. But it was a self-consciousness divorced from actual living, conscious human beings. All of history was supposed to be the unfurling of this self-consciousness through a process of what they call criticism, all of which took place in the minds of the philosophers. The Hegelian dialectic was said to have been stood on its head in this sense, because it took the human mind rather than material reality as its starting point, and because it ended up looking quite ridiculous, like someone standing on their head. Marx recognized that for philosophy to have any practical significance, it had to be placed on a real basis. And this recognition drove him towards materialism and to the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach had also been a Hegelian, but he went further than the young Hegelians in that he tried to break entirely with idealism. In short, he placed the natural world, matter, before thought, including religion. The young Hegelians had made criticism of religion a major part of their program. But what Feuerbach said is that religion does not create or direct human beings. In fact, human beings create religion. For Feuerbach, all religion was what he described as the alienated essence of human beings. We aren't able to be ourselves, express our own nature because of the constraints of society. We therefore create an abstract, perfect being. And that's what, according to Feuerbach, that is what Jesus Christ is in Christianity. Us taking our own alienated essence, projecting it outside ourselves, and then worshipping the very humanity that we lack because of the society we live in. The task was therefore to overcome this alienation from ourselves, become reunited with what he called our species being. And this had a big impact, not just on Marx, but on a wide layer of German intellectuals at the time. Marx's introduction to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which was published in the first and only issue of the Franco-German Annals, draws quite heavily on Feuerbach. For instance, in his famous lines, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions." But in addition to Feuerbach, Marx was constantly reading and discussing with socialists and communists in Paris. And not only theorists, he was attending meetings of German and French workers where these ideas were being debated from the standpoint of the real workers' movement. And this contact with French socialism and the working class gave Marx's ideas an edge that Feuerbach's never had. Marx actually pointed out that all French socialism had its origin in the ideas, the materialist ideas that emerged in France in the 18th century. These ideas held that people aren't inherently good or evil, but are determined by their conditions and by education. Therefore, if you want people to be good, you should provide them with a good environment. But that isn't just a philosophical question, it's a political one. And even before the French Revolution, some French philosophers were talking about communism, using the word communism. But the French Revolution, and in particular the disappointment at what became of the French Revolution, gave birth to the phenomenon of what was called utopian socialism in France. Now, I could do a whole talk on this, but I don't have time. I'll just limit myself to talking briefly about arguably the two most famous French socialists, Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier. Saint-Simon talked about planning industry and the economy in order to develop the economy and technology to such a point that there would be no poverty and the state itself would become redundant and pass away. Fourier talked about how there were inevitable stages in the development of human society. Present bourgeois civilization was just one of these stages, which would be inevitably overthrown by another. And the next stage of human existence would be socialism. These ideas had an influence on the young Karl Marx and many other socialists at the time. But it's very important to point out that these socialists were not revolutionaries. And despite some of these materialist and dialectical ideas, they remained utopian. The reason for this is they rejected the class struggle completely. Saint-Simon explicitly said that the purpose of his progress was to avoid the class struggle. And the people who were going to be planning the economy were capitalists and bankers on behalf of the proletariat. And for the followers of Fourier, the whole question of class struggle was irrelevant. The establishment of socialism for them was traveling across to the United States of America and founding colonies where they would live together along socialist principles. Now, as you can probably tell, this didn't result in the establishment of socialism in the United States of America, but it did establish the first winery in Illinois. On the other hand, you did have revolutionary communists in France at that time, but they had no scientific conception as to how the revolution was to be carried out. Followers of Gracchus Babeuf, who tried to lead a communist uprising, believed the task was simply to take power by a conspiracy and then establish a communist dictatorship across the country. Yep. From these discussions with all these different trends, Marx drew some very important conclusions. On the one hand, he identified that the proletariat was to play the leading role in the communist revolution. They were the class that had the means and the interests to carry out this revolution, not the bourgeoisie. But this striving of the proletariat for emancipation had to be combined with a scientific theory of struggle. And it's a funny fact of history that only a few months after Marx published this idea, the first ever uprising of the German working class in history took place. Yeah, the rising of weavers in Silesia. Although I should add, I don't think that's because they read the Franco-German annals. But what this did signify is that the working class in Germany was announcing its entrance onto the stage of history for the first time. And this coincides with another extremely important turning point in Marx's life, which is his meeting with Friedrich Engels in August 1844. He had actually met Engels briefly before in 1842. But according to Engels, he was a bit frosty with him because Engels was still a young Hegelian and Marx had already started to move on. But this time in Paris, they spent 10 days discussing non-stop, and they concluded that they were absolutely unanimous on all the fundamental points. And it's worth mentioning that independently of Marx, Engels had come to very similar conclusions, especially about the role of the proletariat. Engels' father was actually a capitalist, an industrialist. His company owned a factory in Manchester, which was part of the industrial heartlands of Britain at that time. And Engels was sent to work in that factory as part of the management. But while in Manchester, he saw with his own eyes the rapid capitalist industrial development taking place in Britain. He studied British political economy, like the ideas of Adam Smith, and he made close contact with the workers' movement that existed in Britain at that time. He saw for himself strikes and bitter class struggles in Manchester, and wrote articles for the paper of the Chartists. Now, the National Charter Association, as it was called, was the first political party of the working class in history, in the world. And although the primary demand of the Chartists was universal suffrage, male universal suffrage, votes for workers, Engels recognized that behind this was a revolutionary movement of the working class for political power. And so when he met with Marx, he was coming with all of these concrete stories about the role of the working class and the development of the economy. So the first thing, once they'd realized that they agreed with each other, the first thing that Marx and Engels decided to do was settle accounts with their former friends in the Young Hegelians. And the result of this is called the Holy Family, or the Critique of Critical Criticism, as it was also called, which they wrote in late 1844. And it was actually published in February 1845, which is pretty much exactly 180 years ago today. This work basically represents Marx and Engels' demolition of idealism in all its forms. First, they set out that ideas are abstractions that we draw from reality, from experience. But then they explain that with the Hegelian method, these ideas that we have just abstracted from the world are then taken to be the driving force of the world's development. They give an amusing example of the absolute fruit. If from apples and pears and oranges you abstract a certain category of fruit, and you then say that this idea that you've just drawn out of real existing fruit is actually the essence and cause of all the fruit in the world, and you then set out the existence of apples, oranges, and pears as necessary logical stages in the realization of the absolute fruit, you have exactly the same method that the approach that the young Hegelians took to history. You abstract an idea of what humans are, of human nature, and then you claim that every period in history is simply the realization of that idea that you've just come up with. And Marx and Engels reply to this with I think, a very profound passage in the Holy Family. History does nothing. It possesses no immense wealth. It wages no battles. It is man, real, living man, who does all that. History is not, as it were, a person apart, using man to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims. And they also drew out the practical significance of this. They attacked the passivity and the contempt that the young Hegelians had for the masses. For people like Bruno Bauer, the masses, people like the working class, were just a stupid mob to be directed by the ideas, specifically the ideas of Bruno Bauer, who, by the way, had obtained a professor position by this time. Actually, it just occurred to me that, funnily enough, the Prussian censor didn't shut him down. Presumably, they didn't consider critical criticism to be a threat, or they couldn't understand a word of it, one of those. But importantly, for Marx and Engels, it was precisely the revolutionary movement of the masses in pursuit of their real aims that is the driving force in history. Therefore, philosophy, rather than activity simply basing itself on philosophical abstractions, philosophy must base itself on the activity of real people in pursuit of their aims. And the next step in Marx and Engels' journey is that they're kicked out of Paris under pressure from the Prussian government. The French king, Louis Philippe, is said to have exclaimed the following: "We must rid Paris of German philosophers." So the government of Guizot, who gets an honourable mention in the Communist Manifesto, expels Marx from Paris, and he ends up in Brussels in February 1845. And this sets the stage for the birth of what can truly be considered Marxism. Because when they wrote the Holy Family, Marx and Engels still actually considered themselves Feuerbachians. But they were already going beyond Feuerbach's ideas. And their inevitable break with Feuerbach was crystallized when Marx wrote his theses on Feuerbach in the spring of 1845. Now, like Marx and Engels, Feuerbach said that we have to base our philosophy on mankind, on humanity, on what he called our human essence or human nature. But he never actually explained concretely what that is. It always remained an abstraction. And frankly, this suffered the same problems as the young Hegelians and the absolute fruit. Feuerbach was a materialist. He saw matter as primary and thought as secondary and derived. He studied the laws of the natural world and explained that human consciousness is something that had evolved out of unconscious matter. But after that, when it came to the world of conscious human beings, he rejected materialism. He did not go any further than the materialists of the 18th century. They correctly said that human beings are just as much a part of nature as anything else. They are another kind of animal. But then they tried to explain human beings and human society only through natural or mechanical laws. For example, they said that human society was just shaped by geography or by our biologically determined nature. But that meant that they couldn't explain how and why society has changed over the years. If a society in a particular geographical climate with the same biological Homo sapiens that we are, Italy, for example, how do we explain all of the very different forms of society that have existed there? And although the materialists could explain that consciousness had evolved and emerged out of matter, they had no explanation for how or why we think as we do. And so it was actually idealist philosophy that developed this more active side of history. But this idealism, as I've explained, it represented a dead end, a philosophical dead end. Feuerbach, basing himself on Hegel, did say something true and profound when he said that nature is only the foundation of human society. It is not the construction itself. That is true. He also explained that man makes himself, which Marx agreed with. But for Feuerbach, man makes himself through consciousness. He basically thinks himself into existence. And so Feuerbach's alternative to religion was simply to find a new religion that worships our true human essence and that is practiced through love. So what did make a genuine contribution to philosophy and influence Marx had basically ended up with the kind of live, laugh, love posters that you see in Airbnbs. But in his theses on Feuerbach, Marx finally finds a way out of this dead end. This crisis, it was a philosophical crisis that had lasted decades, actually, trying to find a way out. He explained that this human essence, human nature, is the ensemble of social relations. But what determines these relations? He adds, in the theses on Feuerbach, that all social life is essentially practical. It is through practical activity, labor, that man makes himself. The transformation of our environment in pursuit of our aims, in turn, transforms our social relations and transforms ourselves. To take another quote from the poet Goethe, "In the beginning was the deed." And it was Marx that finally grounded our philosophy in real human practice, life. And to live as a human being is to work, is to labor. But what do we mean by labor? If we just stopped at this abstract idea of labor in general, we'd be at risk of making just the same mistake as Feuerbach and the young Hegelians. Therefore, to understand humanity requires an empirical struggle of our real relations, how we really work to find truth in the street, which is precisely what Marx and Engels set out to do. That summer, Marx and Engels went to England. They met and discussed with working class activists like Chartists. Marx spent a lot of time in the library reading works of political economy to actually give a positive expression to this philosophical revolution that was carried out in the theses on Feuerbach. But before I move on, there's one last point I want to draw from the theses on Feuerbach, and that's its most famous quote, that hitherto the philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. The point he's making here is that theory that's confined purely to criticism, divorced from revolutionary practice, is sterile and is doomed to be one-sided and false, ultimately. It will miss reality. But to ignore philosophy and theory altogether in the name of being practical is to fight blindfolded and constantly make the same mistakes. Yes, philosophy needs to become practical, but practice needs to become philosophical. Philosophy can only become real as a guide to revolutionary practice. And with this, Marx and Engels succeeded in finally placing philosophy on a real scientific basis, creating what we call dialectical materialism, the most revolutionary philosophy ever conceived. But what makes it revolutionary, by the way, is not that it talks about the need for revolution. Lots of philosophers have talked about revolution. Too many, frankly. What makes dialectical materialism revolutionary is because it is true. It confronts reality as it changes and sees the inevitable development of the new within the womb of the old. not by logical speculation, but by analysis of the real concrete facts. And it was armed with this method and the research they carried out in England that Marx and Engels wrote The German Ideology. This is a work that was never published in their lifetime, never finished, but it is basically the first positive work of historical materialism. And in it, not only did they settle accounts with Feuerbach, but with other German socialists like Karl Marx. We've already had an excellent discussion on historical materialism, and obviously I don't have time to go into this in detail. But one passage from the German ideology that I would like to quote for you. The social structure and the state are continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals, but of individuals not as they appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as they really are, i.e. as they operate and produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions and conditions, independent of their will. In the German ideology, they also talk about the development of manufacturing, of industry, the history of economic development, forming different stages in the evolution of human society. So it's not just Marx announcing, oh yeah, we need a materialist approach to history. He's actually beginning to provide that understanding concretely out of the facts of history. And in bringing these things together, we don't just get a materialist explanation of history. We also get a scientific theory of communism. And in this way, Marx and Engels not only changed our understanding of history, they changed history itself. But what was this scientific theory of communism? Marx and Engels explained that communism, for us, is not a state of affairs to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The communist movement is not just a philosophical trend. It's not just an idea. It is an objective fact. And the conditions of this movement emerge dialectically from the premises now in existence. The development of industry and production that Saint-Simon hinted at, which have unified the world economy and provided the material basis for abundance. But also the creation of a mass of propertyless proletarians, the modern working class, who are driven by their material position to struggle against the existing order. But in overthrowing the existing order, they don't set up a new form of property and exploitation, as other classes like the bourgeoisie have done in the past, because they don't have any property of their own. And so in taking hold of the property of society, society itself actually takes control of the means of production. But this revolution in history and in philosophy actually represents the abolition of philosophy itself, or at least as philosophy had been conceived of previously. Decades later, Engels would write a pamphlet called Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. And in it he explains, it is no longer a question of anywhere of inventing interconnections from out of our brains, but of discovering them in the facts. For philosophy, which has been expelled from nature and history, there remains only the realm of pure thought, the theory of the laws of the thought process itself, logic and dialectics. So in this way, philosophy was not abolished in the sense of it being completely abandoned or destroyed. I mean, we're talking about philosophy right now. In overthrowing the old metaphysical philosophy, Marx and Engels preserved the rational kernel, that which was valuable in philosophy, the dialectical method applied to practical revolutionary science. That is our philosophy. So here we have the birth of Marxism, Marxist theory. But what did this look like in practice? Marx and Engels didn't just publish books. They turned to the workers' movement as it existed at the time and debated prominent socialists and communists in order to establish a common program and actually form an organization, a party, to take these ideas into the movement. It's an interesting quirk of history that the first work of Marxism, the first published work of Marxist theory, was not written in German. It was written in French, The Poverty of Philosophy, written by Marx as a polemic against the ideas of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, considered one of the founders of anarchism. And these ideas were becoming influential, particularly in the French labor movement at that time. Proudhon also claimed to unite British political economy with dialectical philosophy, actually. But he actually took all the prejudices of the bourgeois economists. And in the name of science and revolution, he told the workers not to strike, not to struggle for political power, but to set up cooperatives and trade their goods at cost price, which would lead to the gradual abolition of the state. Now, Marx took up these questions and even wrote in French. Why? Because he thought to follow this program would lead to ruin, and he wanted the French workers to be able to read it in their own tongue. And rather than leading to the gradual abolition of the state, Proudhon's ideas led to the gradual abolition of the cooperatives, eventually of Proudhonism itself, really. Marx always had an implacable attitude to theory, not for theory's sake, but for the success of the revolutionary movement of the working class. And I want to give an anecdote of his famous or infamous meeting with Wilhelm Weitling as an example of this. Weitling was a leading figure in an organization called the League of the Just, not the Justice League. A secret revolutionary organization, an underground revolutionary organization of German workers, and it was a working class organization. Weitling himself was a worker from a very poor background. He put forward a kind of messianic Christian communism with him as the prophet, which was actually pretty popular at the time. And he called for an immediate invasion of Prussia by German artisans working abroad. So he went to Brussels and met with Marx and Engels in 1846 to persuade them to join in his scheme. And in the meeting, Marx says, "Tell us, Weitling, you who have made such a noise in Germany with your preaching." So got off to a nice friendly start. "On what grounds do you justify your activity? And on what do you intend to base it on in the future?" Weitling apparently began by saying that his aim was not to create new economic theories, but to adopt those that were most appropriate, to open the eyes of the workers to the horrors of their condition, because they're incapable of seeing their own condition themselves, apparently, and to teach them to never more believe any promises of their rulers. Now, an observer who attended this meeting said that Marx responded with an angry frown and said that to rouse the population without giving them any firm, well-thought-out reasons would be to deceive them with vain, dishonest play at preaching. Now, this offended Weitling, who pointed out that he had hundreds of followers, more than Marx and Engels, who didn't have any followers at this time. And he said that his modest work, perhaps of greater weight for the common cause than criticism and armchair analysis of doctrines far from the world of the suffering and afflicted people. And at this, Marx jumped up out of his chair, slammed his fist on the table, and said, "Ignorance never yet helped anyone." And then the meeting ended in great confusion.
Yeah. Right.
Now, I repeat this in detail, not just because it's a great window into Marx's beliefs and his activity, but because how familiar are Weitling's arguments today? Reading theory is elitist, or bougie. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said reading is bougie. What we need is action, which is, of course, based on the most immediate demand and the lowest common denominator. Now, with people like AOC saying this kind of thing, it's dishonest from the beginning. They're happy for the workers to understand nothing so that they'll believe anything. Weitling was honest, but an honest confusion is still confusion. And I can't help but think of times when I've argued with activists in university occupations and been told this is no place for discussing what program we should have for the movement, because we have to have an hour-long debate about whether we use plastic cups at the university or we bring ceramic cups from home. The ceramic cups won, if you're interested.
Don't.
But this shows Marx's approach to theory and the importance of theory for the real struggle. And Lenin perfectly summed up Marx's philosophy when he said, without revolutionary theory, there could be no revolutionary movement. And what was the outcome of this theoretical struggle? All this theorizing and armchair criticism. Marx and Engels won over Weitling's organization, the League of the Just. There was a big split in the League because the majority were tired of all these demagogic phrases about uprisings and revolutions with no theoretical base to them. So one of the leaders of the League, Joseph Moll, traveled to Brussels and told Marx and Engels, "We are completely convinced of your ideas, and we want you to attend our Congress and explain them so that they can become the program of the League." There are actually two of these congresses in June and November of 1847. The League of the Just changed its name to the Communist League. Their slogan of "All men are brothers" was changed to "Workers of the world unite," and they commissioned Marx to write a manifesto. The result of this, as you may know, is the Communist Manifesto, the greatest work of political literature ever written, arguably one of the greatest works of literature full stop ever written, which remains a founding document, the founding document of our movement to this day. It doesn't explicitly go into the philosophical questions that I've summarized today, but without the philosophical struggle that Marx and Engels waged, both internally and externally, that document would never have been written. Now, this is really where the story begins. As we know, the publication of the Communist Manifesto coincided with the outbreak of the Revolution of 1848. And Marxism didn't stop developing from this point. Marx and Engels continued to develop and enrich their ideas based on their own experience of the revolutionary movement. But the revolution and counter-revolution was a harsh testing ground of all tendencies, including the Communist League. Even with the best program, the League proved to be too small, too weak, and it dissolved like a sugar lump in the boiling cauldron of the revolution. Marx himself gave everything to the revolution of 1848, all of his money. Engels risked his life in the firing line, and Marx, Jenny, and their children faced extreme deprivation as refugees in London. He remained true to his ideas and to the revolutionary movement of the working class. And I know I've gone over time and the chair looks nervous, but I feel at this point it's necessary to pose the question, what is philosophy? Maybe I should have started with that. The word means love of wisdom in ancient Greek. But what is wisdom? The great philosopher and dialectician Heraclitus said this profound statement. Wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature. Well, if that's true, and Heraclitus knew something about wisdom, then Marx and Engels were the embodiment of philosophy. To seek the truth concretely, to face reality square in the face, to speak it plainly in contempt to the censor, to chart your course entirely by the demands of that truth, and to overcome every barrier, to face every sacrifice unflinchingly in the struggle to realize the new world, fighting to be born within the old. That is real philosophy, not any of this tedious, barren hair-splitting of these educated ignoramuses in the universities, which amounts to the constant repetition that there is no truth. You cannot know it, let alone speak it. And the only way to act in accordance with its nature is to do nothing. This is why 180 years after Marx and Engels first developed their philosophy, the name of Marx and Marxism still haunts the ruling class and is alive and well in this room and all over the world. Lenin once wrote that Marxism is all-powerful because it is true, and we shouldn't be complacent about this. The truth is a weapon in the class struggle. The bourgeoisie knew that. When they were fighting against the old feudal order, they took the scientific ideas of the likes of Galileo and made it part of their revolutionary program. And today they obscure and besmirch the truth precisely because they see in it the seeds of their own destruction. So it's not enough just to say Marx is right. Marx isn't here. It's our weapon. We have to learn to use it. You know, the title posed, how did Marx become a Marxist? In struggle. That would have been a shorter lead-off, to be fair, yeah. But the point I'm making is Marxism is not just a collection of texts. It is a living method, which we must master and carry into practice today. And it is this method which will be our most powerful weapon in the titanic revolutionary events to come. Thank you very much.